Okay, you can push that button now. Okay, good morning. Today is Friday, the 18th of April, 2008. And I'm Bob Andrade, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in California. Part of our mission is to record and preserve the history of our country's military conflicts, especially World War II. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who participate in these conflicts. Today I'm here at the museum along with fellow volunteer Lou Boyles, and our guest is Birgit.
Yes.
Today we have the honor and privilege of interviewing Ellwood Blondfield. He was in the 100th Bomb Group, the 350th Bomb Squadron of the 8th Air Force. So we're going to talk to him, and we'll talk about a lot of things. Nice to have you here.
You can call me Woody.
Ellwood. Okay, Woody. Okay, Woody.
That's short.
Real glad to have you here, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask your full name. Okay, cut it off now. Cut. Okay, now I'll go over here and start. Okay. Then so what I usually do is come over and then I'll turn this over here, and this right here is, see right here, where you feel comfortable there. Perfect, okay? Mm-hmm. Oh, it looks good. It looks real good. Okay, we're done with this. Okay. Okay, Woody, would you spell your first and last name for us, please?
My first name is Ellwood, E-L-W-O-O-D, and last name Blondfield, B-L-O-N-D-F-I-E-L-D.
Okay, where were you born?
I was born in wheat fields in middle of Kansas.
Okay. And did you go to school there?
I graduated from high school in Minneapolis, Kansas.
Okay. How about your father? Where did he come from?
He was from McPherson, Kansas, and his father was a railroad man.
And
Actually from England.
Okay, how about your mother?
My mother was a Pennsylvania Dutch, and she was related to the ancestry back through even Daniel Boone. So about as American as you can get.
And how did they meet? Do you know?
Well, I don't really know that. I think it was a picnic in Lindsborg, Kansas.
And do you remember any of your grandparents at all?
Oh yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, they were from really railroad people, and they had moved to McPherson, Kansas, and he developed an insurance business there, an insurance company.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers.
3 brothers.
And,
3 brothers.
3 brothers.
Yeah.
Okay, now you, what kind of neighborhood did you grow up in?
Strictly a farm community. When I was young and in the teens, I was driving heavy farm equipment in the wheat fields and plowing and doing all that sort of thing on a farm.
And did you have any sports? Did you involve any sports at all in school?
Very trivially. I worked most of that time.
Did you have any girlfriends?
Not until I was a senior in high school.
Okay. Okay. Did you have any jobs while you were in high school?
Yes, I worked in a service station, filling station at that time, for my entire last 3 years of school. That's how I put myself through school.
Okay, and when you through school now, you're talking through college,
So no, that was through high school.
high school.
Yeah. I was working when I was 12 years old.
Yeah, now, did you actually went through the school system in
Kansas.
in Kansas? Okay. Now, did you have a church there that you went to?
Oh, yes. Yes, everybody in those communities in those days went to church.
Okay. Now, can you recall how your parents and your people around you made it through the Great Depression?
Well, we didn't make it through. We lost the farm and had to turn it back to the bank. And from then on, we scrounged jobs everywhere we could find them to keep going. As a child, I even hosed out chicken houses behind the produce stores. Did anything to make money.
Wow. Yeah, okay, now you're out of school now, and did you know anything was going on in either whether in China? Were you aware of that? Were you conscious?
We were aware of the German takeovers in Austria and places like that, and later, in years later, began to become very much aware of the bombings of London and the total destruction that the Germans were waging on those countries. And we talked about it as kids.
How about China? Were you aware of what's going on there?
Didn't know too much about China at the time. We knew of the Flying Tigers, but we didn't know much more.
Okay, what were you doing, if you can remember, December 7th, 1941?
Yes, by this time I had moved to Southern California and was living in Hollywood at the time and working at North American Aviation, building the B-25 bombers. That's the Mitchell bomber. And I was helping with one expert mechanic who was doing the assembly of the landing gears.
Now, were you fascinated with flying, or have you done any flying before you
No,
went in?
I was interested in it, but I've never done it.
Okay, now your Pearl Harbor's happened. How old were you when Pearl Harbor happened?
Well, let me think. I was about, Pearl Harbor was 41. I was 20.
Okay. And did you think about going in at that time when Pearl Harbor happened? Was you a
Well,
group that did it, or?
They wanted me. I was working in the aircraft country and company, North American Aviation, and they were interested to keep me working. And then the draft came along and started to draw my name, and I just let them draft me. The people at the aircraft company were very disappointed and wanted me to stay there, but I said, no, I think I'll go into the service because the rest of the men that I know at that time are going into the service, so I'll go. So I was drafted into the Army. And then from the service score tests, I scored rather highly on that test. So they sent me to radio operator mechanic school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And at that time, there were 364 of us, and I graduated 0.2 of a point from the top electronics engineer who was also in the class, and that drew up a name of top 10 students that offered cadet training because we could forego the 2-year college requirement at the time. So I immediately decided that's what I wanted to do. So I took up pilot training at that time.
And you had never been flying, you'd never flown before?
No.
Okay, but you did go to basic training first.
Oh, yes.
Before you.
Yes, went to basic training Well, I went to basic training in the Army, and then basic training in the Air Corps, and primary, basic, and advanced in the Air
Okay,
Corps.
what year was that you were drafted?
I was drafted in 42.
42. How was boot camp for you as a 20-year-old?
It was a lot of mud and sweat and calisthenics. I was in St. Petersburg, Florida, and there was a lot of mud and sweat in boot camp.
So you're very happy to be accepted as a cadet.
Absolutely, I loved it.
No more mud, huh?
Loved it.
I've heard the story before, by the way. Now you're a cadet training. Where's your cadet training? Where to start at?
Started at just north of Bakersfield. What's the name? Primary training in Rankin Flying Academy in Tulare, California.
Tulare.
And then basic in Bakersfield at Minter, and then advanced in Pecos, Texas for twins.
And where you find the AT-6?
Oh, that was afterwards. I didn't fly AT-6s. I went straight into B-17 transition in Roswell, New Mexico, after I graduated. They kept pushing me ahead because of my grades and the apparent skills.
Now, did you have a choice of going into bombers or to fighters or
Well,
both engines?
I made a request at the time that I would go into heavies, and they honored that and put me directly into B-17 transition school in Roswell.
Okay, and then you did your training, your advanced training in B-17s in the United States.
In Roswell, Mexico, and then in Lincoln, Nebraska, and a combat B-17 training out of there, and that was in South Dakota. And after that, we went back to Lincoln, Nebraska for combat assignment.
Okay, now, when you were assigned overseas, did you go with your plane, or did you get your planes when you got there?
No, in Lincoln, Nebraska, there were 400 and some pilots and crews together at this time. And there were 21 of us assigned brand new airplanes out of Boeing. And those airplanes were only flown for 5 hours. Their instrumentation had not been calibrated. So we spent 2 weeks. The rest of the pilots and their crews, 400 and some, were sent on the Queen Mary. We were kept over for 2 weeks to calibrate all the instruments on these B-17s, which were brand new out of the factory. And we kept those B-17s, and they were written on paper that we owned them, and we were going to fly them to Europe over the North Atlantic, which we did. And when we got to England, then we assigned the airplane to the replacement depot there.
You turned it over to somebody else?
Turned it back over to the replacement depot. But I even still have papers that I owned the airplane for that trip.
You got a receipt for that, huh?
Right.
Okay, now you're what was the first base you went to in England, air base?
Okay, it was a replacement depot, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of it right now, but they assigned the crews to the various bomb groups. And my airman came to me after the first day and said, "Whatever you do, don't get assigned to the 100th Bomb Group," because that's got the reputation of being destroyed several times over. And there was a reason for that. And so when the data came out and the assignments were made the next day, here I was in the 100th Bomb Group. Well, when we went into the 100th Bomb Group, they had just before we entered that day, they had lost a very large number of people. So fortunately for me, a very good friend of mine who was a pilot, Clifford Clipperton, and I were assigned to the same squadron, 350. And both of us were extremely good formation pilots. So we improved the situation immediately. And when we got into combat and the Germans started shooting at us, excuse me, our squadron was so tight in formation that the tracers that went out discouraged the fighters from attacking us. They just peeled off and went to somebody else. So it was a blessing in disguise.
And what was some of the places that you, some of the trips that you made, the runs?
Oh, I don't remember them all, but Berlin.
Just a few of them.
Yeah. But Berlin I was shot down by flak in Berlin and managed to get the pile of junk home to this side of the line in Belgium. And then we went to Bremerhaven. We went to various places all over the map of Germany.
A railroad.
Mostly railroad marshalling yards, and the marshalling yards over the sub-pens in
Hamburg.
Hamburg. We actually carried blockbuster bombs to there, trying to break through the concrete roofs of the submarine pens. But there were a lot of interesting missions. But the flak was so heavy most of the time, and the fighter attack on us was so much that I was, by virtue of being a good formation pilot, I was in the deputy lead spot right after the lead airplane in the middle of the formation. So I got the reputation of, if I went along, everybody else was safe because I got all the damage, because they fired at me a lot.
Did you have to bail out, or did
Never
you
had
crash
to bail out.
land?
I had the option twice, but managed to recover the airplane well enough to be able to glide it into the line and get over the line in Belgium at the time. Because the second time I lost an airplane, I lost first to flak in Berlin. The second time I lost to ME-262 jet fighters. And they were really tough. They took me out of the air in about 4 seconds. And that airplane was garbage when I landed it again. But it was very, very difficult to fly because all of the cables to the tail section and the empennage were cut except one elevator cable. And my co-pilot and I had to force the wheel forward to keep the plane from spinning in. And to take away some of that imbalance, I sent my top turret engineer back to the tail and told him to throw out everything that was loose. I mean everything. They threw out guns and ammo and radio pieces and everything. And the tail got light enough so that we could manage to hold the nose down, keep it from spinning in, and get back to this side of the fighting line at the time and managed to park it, which was another story which was extremely interesting, but takes a little time to tell that story, so I won't bother here. But it was very interesting.
So you were never captured?
Never captured.
But you come close, and I'm sure you had several friends that were, maybe, huh?
Well, yes, many people that were within our squadron that were shot down some died, some survived.
Any more memorable experiences that might come to mind?
Well,
I imagine every flight was a memorable experience.
yes. My tail gunner was a wonderful man. And He was running the tail when the ME-262 jets came in on us and attacked us straight on from the tail. And after we managed to land the airplane in Belgium, he came up to us crying. He says, I was firing tracers into those cockpits all the time, but he says nothing took them down. I said, well, after sight, I know that they have a armor plate that's shaped as a fuselage of that pilot's cockpit. So he's sitting behind an armor plate, you can't knock him down. I says, the only way you get rid of that airplane is to shoot the engines out. He says, okay. He says, I don't know what to do next time. But we had a lot of little experiences like that. He was the only one that ever got the Purple Heart. He got a piece of shrapnel in his heel. And that was, everybody else on the airplane
He was very fortunate.
managed to survive. They were just in the right place to miss all the internal explosions.
What accommodations did you get?
Well, to make a long story short, landing that airplane in Belgium in the fog was a very unusual experience. In the fog, we learned where the emergency airport was on a map from the briefing that morning, and we went to a rotating beacon which was on a Jeep that oriented us to that airfield. We went to that airfield after flying in the fog and laying down right on the ground almost, flying, and we couldn't find a field. My navigator came up the cockpit and said, it's not there. It's not where we have it plotted. He says, what do we do? I said, let's go back to the beacon. We'll do a ever-increasing spiral until we find it, because it's out there somewhere. Otherwise, the Jeep wouldn't be there. Well, we found it 180 degrees opposite of where it was marked on the map that morning. And when it came in to land, it was a field full of P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s. And there was no place to taxi a B-17. There was a colonel who had landed, managed to do the same thing as I did, and land his airplane on that field. And the only way he could get back to a taxi place was to taxi on the runway. They were shooting green flares for me to land in the fog. When he got down to the flare and could see, he was on the runway, in the middle of the runway, heading to me taxi. There was only one thing I could do. I had 2 dead engines on my left, and my 2 right engines were still going, and I had to go around. Now, ordinarily it was considered almost impossible to make a full flare and still go around on 2 engines with a beat-up airplane. Half the empennage gone, 6 feet off the right wingtip was gone. The airplane didn't fly very well. But I kept the nose down, just flying within 5 feet of all the airplanes on the field, and managed, after 10 miles of flying, to get it back to critical speed for the 2 engines. I was just barely able to hold that speed without losing it. And then after about 10 miles, realized we were climbing a very small hill. Once I got over the peak of the hill, pushed the nose down, and I got my critical speed again to where I could climb. So I climbed back, went to the beacon, found the airport again, and this time landed. But that was a story that there were about 100 pilots from all these fighter airplanes on the ground at that field, sitting on the ground. They wrote a personal letter to the commander of the 100th Bomb Group recommending me for the DFC for that. Because basically, if I'd have landed without being able to go around, my crew would have died. The crew I'd have hit coming taxiing on would have died. So there were 2 crews alive just by being able to get that airplane airborne again. So it was a pretty challenging experience.
I can imagine. Any other commendations or?
Well, that was basically it. And several air medals, of course. Everybody got air medals.
And did you ever go on leave during the war there? Or go,
Not during the war. No.
You didn't get an opportunity to go anywhere.
No, we were short pilots all the time.
And when did you? Where were you at when the war ended?
I was in London. I was, oh, by the way, about a month before the war ended, there were approximately 200,000 Dutch people about to die from starvation. They were boiling tulip bulbs to survive. And we did a food mission. We converted our bomb base to wood platforms hinged on the outside and shackled on the inside to the bomb shackles. Then we stacked them with K rations. The Dutch people planted telephone poles in their soccer fields, put fishnets up between the telephone poles, and put big white crosses on the soccer field for us to target. Now, while we were doing that, it was fog all the way down. We could never fly and locate these things from the air. We had to do it navigating just about 100 feet off the ground, 50 to 100 feet off the ground, all the way across the channel, and we had to find these fields. We found them and dropped these K rations, and they estimated that they saved approximately 95% of all the K rations we dropped. We were so successful at dropping them into the nets, and the K rations would roll out the nets on the field. That was a very special effort. I flew 3 of those.
That was a special trip.
And that was very, very interesting.
That was just a month before.
It was just a month before they declared an armistice.
What did you do when the war ended afterward?
Well, I started flying VIPs all over Europe and North Africa. We started flying Army troops from the infantry that were brought back from the front, and they were being transported over to Burma to fight the backside of the war in Japan. And we would fly them from down from England to Casablanca, and then C-54s would pick them up from there and fly them to Burma. So,
did you think that you might be transferred over to fly against the Japanese?
oh yes, I was already assigned to fly B-29s. And when the A-bomb was dropped, they shut down that B-29 school in 5 hours.
And where was that at?
The school was in Florida. But before I got over there, we had another mission after the war that was very interesting. There were a lot of prisoners of war being held in Czechoslovakia. And one day, about 100 crews, we were just skeleton crews, but 100 flight crews with 100 B-17s went over to Horshing, Austria, and we picked up hundreds and hundreds of prisoners of war that were being held over there and repatriated them back to Paris and wherever they came from. My people that I picked up came back to Villacoublay, Paris. They'd get out of the airplane and get down on their hands and knees and kiss the ground, because they'd been in prison for approximately 6 years. And if you remember in the history of the household in those days, there used to be a very large coffee can for coffee grounds. Now it's shrunken down to about 3 pounds or so. But they all had one of those coffee cans when they got on the airplane. I asked the French guy, "What's that for?" He looked at me as if to say, "You dummy, that's their toilet." And they all got on the airplane with what miserable belongings they had in that big coffee can. And
Were they from several different countries, or?
Oh yes, we flew them back to a lot of different places. My particular group, I flew to Villacoublay, Paris, because that was their home. I'd call them up to the cockpit one at a time when I was flying over the Danube River, and I'd show them, explain to them that that's the Danube River down there. They'd look at it and they'd turn so happy and cry at the same time. It was an experience.
So what year did you come home?
I came home in 46.
46. How did you come home?
Well, I came home on a Liberty ship. They weren't wasting the airplane fuel. They were scrapping the airplanes over there. So we couldn't fly them back. And we came home on a Liberty ship.
Into New York?
Into New York Harbor.
So you got to see the Statue of Liberty?
Oh, sure. And then from there, we were flown to Beale Air Force Base for.
Yeah. What were your thoughts when you saw that Statue of Liberty?
Well, it's an interesting thing.
I'm home.
I'm home.
That's great.
One of the most interesting things about all of the officers that I was attached with, they had a dream of coming home, and you know what the first thing they wanted to buy? A new gabardine suit. Gabardine suits were popular at that time, and it was the mark of success. So the first thing you bought when you got home was a gabardine suit.
What did you do after the service? Right after the service, what did you start doing?
Well, I went back to UCLA, and I finished my college degree in 1950, and then I was in graduate school for another year. And after that, I worked for Beckman Scientific Instruments in training people all over the world to use infrared spectrophotometers and gas chromatographs and instruments of that nature, which are analytical chemistry instruments. That's what I did the rest of my life. I went all over the world, around the world, back and forth to Europe 3 times a year, or every year for over 15 years. And I was teaching professors analytical chemistry with spectrophotometers and gas chromatographs.
What was your college degree?
Well, I got a bachelor's degree, and I was going toward the doctorates. And I just simply ran out of money, and my wife at the time wanted to start a family, and so we dropped it right there.
Were you married at that time?
I was married.
When did you get married?
Oh boy. It was 1942.
So all the time you were overseas, you were
Yes,
married.
I was married overseas.
And what was your wife's maiden name?
Peterson. She was from Yonkers, New York.
Okay, and where did you meet her?
I met her in Santa Monica when I was first in the military.
At the church.
Yeah, I met her in church.
And did she work or?
Yes, she worked as a registrar at UCLA. And with that and my $125 a month, I managed to get through the university.
Yeah, there were a lot of women working during the Second World War.
They sure were.
The men were gone.
Well, when I was in combat,
Yes.
I put her through the university before I came back. So she graduated from UCLA before I came back.
And then what about your career then? What did you do?
Well, after I got out of the university, I went in with Beckman Scientific Instruments, and I was in charge of about a third of their engineering. And I went all over the world teaching the products to the chemists and professors in Europe, because that was our method of getting our products into the European market and selling. Once I'd teach a professor how to use a double beam infrared spectrophotometer, he would go out to the industry there and say, hey, this is the best way to do this particular chemistry. or gas chromatography, the same thing. I had a counterpart over there in Geneva, and he was of a similar education, and he would take the information and go to the universities and to the big chemical industries in Europe, and that's how he sold product. So the selling of the product was so successful that they just kept me going back and forth.
Hmm. But when did you retire?
You went over to Hamilton.
Yes, I'm trying to think of the year.
Oh, let's see.
I've been retired. I'm 86 now, and I've been retired 20 years. So it was in
88.
88, it's 80-some, early 80, I retired.
No, late.
Late 80, late 80.
88 or 89.
88 or 89, yeah.
Now, what did you do when you retired?
Well,
Played.
we played and did a little traveling off and on. And of course, when my wife died of cancer, I remarried the present wife, and we've done a lot of cruising and various things to keep busy. I've done a little substitute teaching in science in the colleges and the schools. And I've taught a lot of private flying because of my experience. Most instructor pilots now don't have this kind of experience, so I was highly sought at Fullerton Airport as a private instructor to student pilots.
So, when did you first come to the desert?
Oh, a year or 2 years ago.
2 years ago here in Apple Valley.
You don't live here, but you visit here, right?
Well, yes,
The
but
children are down.
we live here now in Apple Valley,
Mm-hmm.
and we came there about 2 years ago.
And how many children do you have?
I have 4 children. My present wife has 2, so between us, we have 6 and about 30-some grandchildren.
How many grandchildren?
No, 20.
20 and
8 great-grandchildren.
great-grandchildren, yeah.
Now, where do they all live?
All around the West Coast and Michigan.
Yeah.
And what do you do for recreation?
Well, right now,
Have you done a lot of ice skating
I've
and
done a lot of
skiing?
figure ice skating,
We've done a lot
and
of
I've
skiing.
done a lot of downhill skiing. Almost every year we downhill skied until I was 84. And
And you ice skate to about that point too.
and I was figure ice skating up till about that time. When I moved to Apple Valley, we didn't have an ice rink, so I didn't have a way to ice skate anymore.
We went to an ice show yesterday out here.
Up here in Cathedral City, we went to an ice
Yeah.
show. A whole bunch of friends of mine from ice shows were giving a little miniature show to all of their own friends over here in a little makeshift ice rink, waiting for a new big ice rink to be built in La Quinta. So they invited us into that little ice show, and there were just a handful of us, and afterwards they had a little brunch for us. So it was very nice.
Let's get you to come up and sit next to him just for a moment here, since you don't have to, I don't know if it's picking up your voice and all that too, but we're.
Okay.
That's good.
You know, this is my wonderful wife, Bibi.
This is your wife,
Right.
and her name is
Bibi.
BB.
Bibi,
Yeah, called BB.
or Birgit Victoria.
Yeah.
Birgit Victoria.
Yes, that's right.
She's from Sweden.
And where did you meet this lady?
She was running a Scandia Gardens restaurant in La Habra.
Yeah. And he used to come and eat
And
at my place.
When I worked at Beckman Scientific, I used to go over there with my engineers, and that's where I met her, at that restaurant.
And Birgit, you're from where?
Sweden,
When did you come to the U.S.?
1954.
And you've lived here ever since, huh?
Yes.
Are you talking about engineering? I found a little bit about you on the internet there. I think you're an inventor, aren't you?
I've done a little, not big deals, but small things.
That's impressive.
Well, you made big deals, but no money.
No, the money went to Beckman Scientific because any patent was, the trick was the lawyer would come down and give you $1 and you'd sign a paper and the patent belonged to the corporation.
And what was your invention?
Oh,
Well, you said several of them, huh?
yeah, little ones.
They had
Trivial.
to do with the moon.
Yeah, I did find one, and it was the oxygen multi-sensor switching circuit,
Okay.
and that's impressive. So, for recreation, you do skiing and ice skating, or
Right. And ballroom
Okay.
dancing.
and doing what?
Ballroom dancing.
Oh,
I ballroom danced all my life.
do you watch Dancing with the Stars?
We watch it.
It's
My
a little bit-
my
Look-
criticisms go pretty much in the line with their main guy, Glenn Goodman, and I'm almost 100% in agreement with him on everything.
That's great. Now, we want to thank you very much for coming and giving us insight to some of the history, and it's an impressive job that you did, and we thank you for your service.